Music. Okay, and hello, my fellow risers. We are now live on Kick, Twitch, and YouTube. Good. Looks like the dogs want to come back in. Then every time I let them in, they just run right back out again. All right, I'm gonna let them in. So we're doing Philosophy of Psychology, Chapter 7. We already started it yesterday in yesterday's stream. We're in, alright, yeah, I'm gonna go get them. So, the first question... Why did my screen just go black? Am I still streaming? Okay. Okay, so, the first thing is, what are delusions in a clinical setting? Are delusions a type of belief? So we're asking ourselves a few things in this chapter. One, are delusions a type of belief? To that, we say, I don't know. There are different approaches. It's kind of it's just a philosophical question. How do we want to define them? There's the revisionist approach, as well as the conservative approach. Revisionism recommends that we should change our terminology and define beliefs as only attitudes that are responsive to evidence and guide action. But that means that a lot of things that we now call beliefs, not just delusions, but a lot of things that we call beliefs are going to have to be given another name. If followed through, this move would make the category of belief much less populated. Conservatism recommends that we should not change our terminology, and so we can use the term belief quite liberally. After all, ascribing delusions often serves the same purpose as ascribing beliefs. It allows agents to predict and understand other agents' behavior, coordination, and cooperation. Okay, what else have we been doing in this, and are we doing in this chapter? We're trying to figure out what sort of makes delusions distinct, or how do we define the subcategory of beliefs that we call delusions. Also, there's how are delusions formed here, whether it's a experience issue, but then they're reasoning normally about the weird experience. We saw with Capgras delusion, they have this experience of a familiar face not feeling familiar, and so then they come up with this explanation that it is the face, but it's worn by an imposter, and that's why it doesn't feel familiar. On the other hand, we saw that when people have damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex here, and this is another layer of processing, that they don't say, hey, it's an imposter. Even though they do, it does look weird to them, the face that they're looking at. And then we talked about predictive processing, right? So the latest cool thing in neuroscience is that all of your perception, all of your thoughts, and even how you produce actions, it's all about dealing with errors in your prediction of what you should be perceiving, what you should be, or what you predict to be thinking, to be doing, etc. And so big people in that are Andy Clark and Anil Seth. Think that... Oh, and then of course, part of the objective of this chapter is... I'm gonna go let the dogs in. Part of the objective of this chapter... Oh yeah, they're just waiting by the door. Part of the objective of this chapter is to see what we can learn about normal beliefs when we look at clinical delusions. Okay, so we are going to be in the section 7.3, Delusion and Irrationality. We already did, is delusional reasoning irrational? Oh no, we're still in that. We're looking at the jumping to conclusion bias. We looked at this beads in a jar experiment where so people were either given, so there's a jar of 100 beads, either it was 85 pink beads and 15 green beads, or 15 pink beads and then 85% green beads. And the question is, how long does it take a subject? Oh, good, now they're having fun. Oh, there's a squirrel. How long does it take a subject to feel like they know which jar it is, whether it's jar A or jar B? And here's what was interesting. So there were 3 groups, 2 clinical groups, right, with psychiatric disorders. One was their psychiatric disorder was schizophrenia. Another group, they had a psychiatric disorder that was not schizophrenia. And then another group was the normal control group. And what was interesting is that those with delusions, so the schizophrenic group, required 2.22 beats on average. So they looked at 1, 2, maybe 3 beats, and they go, okay, this is the one with 85% pink, or this is the one with 85% green. The normal population, I want to check this. Who had the normal population, people without delusions, but also with no psychiatric, I'm pretty sure, we were looking at 3 or 4 beats. Okay, so 2 or 3 for the ones with delusions, 3 or 4 with the ones with no psychiatric issues, and then in the psychiatric group, but with no delusions, so they had other psychiatric disorders, they're looking at 4 to 5 beats. So we're looking at this jumping to conclusions bias. Was it irrational for the group with schizophrenic delusions to only look at 2 to 3 beats? Nope, not at all, actually. Because in the beats experiment, those with delusions required 2.22 beats on average before reaching a conclusion, which means that they reached a conclusion when the probability of the conclusion was over 0.97, according to Bayesian statistics. So that's perfectly rational to stop at 2 or 3 beats. And that's where we're going to be picking up. Okay, excellent. See how he keeps looking at the door? Either way, I want to adjust the camera. So I'm going to see if they run in. I'm going to adjust the camera so it's a little bit farther forward. And we'll see if they come in. They're probably about to get excited about those birds. Okay, I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Alright, let me just switch cameras so you can see. Yes. So you can see the boys hanging out. Boom. Great. Alright. Beep, 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 beep. Hello, boys. Beep, 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 beep. There you go. Okay, great. So now you've got some more entertainment. Okay, so people with schizophrenic delusions People with schizophrenic delusions were jumping to conclusions the most, but here's where we're picking up. Thus, the finding about the jumping to conclusion bias does not show that people with delusions irrationally jump to a conclusion. Instead, it shows that people without delusions irrationally hesitate to accept a conclusion. Which, I don't know how general of a statement that is. I think it's probably just about the beats. From a logical mathematical point of view, it is the people without delusions, not the people with delusions, who are biased in the sense that their performance deviates from standards of rationality. Of course, I should mention that these standards of rationality are not embodied by humans, okay? And I'm not just saying that. The author was saying that, okay? This is why Hooke, Garrity, and Hemsley write that it may be argued that the diluted sample reached a decision at an objectively rational point. It may further be argued that the two control groups were somewhat overcautious. Interestingly, however, Hooke and Garrity and Hemsley continued, although the diluted sample's responses on two of the measures appears more Bayesian, being less subject to the conservatism bias than normals, it is not possible. Although the diluted sample's responses on two of the measures appears more Bayesian, being less subject to the conservatism bias than normals, it is not possible to conclude that deluded people are better reasoners. Conservatism of this type may, in certain circumstances, be ecologically valid, serving as a useful general strategy under conditions of uncertainty. Conservatism of this type may, in certain circumstances, be ecologically valid, serving as a useful general strategy under conditions of uncertainty. So they're saying that, yeah, but outside of the lab, in the normal ecology, in the normal environment, this kind of hesitation to jump to a conclusion may be a useful strategy. So, in effect, Hooke, Garrity, and Hemsley appeal to the ecological picture of rationality, which we discussed in Chapter 1, and argue that people with delusions could be irrational according to the ecological conception of rationality, although they are rational according to the standard picture of rationality. So, yeah, always following exactly the right rules versus following the rules that are appropriate to the environment that you're in. The reasoning performance of non-clinical participants is somewhat conservative from a logical mathematical point of view, but it makes sense ecologically, because excessive caution is often beneficial for the purposes of survival and reproduction. If Hooke, Garrity, and Hemsley are correct, then delusion is another case in which the standard picture and the ecological picture have different implications for rationality. In any case, the suggestion that those with delusions are, in the standard picture, more rational than those without delusions is surprising, but it is consistent with other empirical findings. For example, a similar pattern emerges when people with delusions are tested in the reasoning tasks of the heuristics and biases program. Wow! In one study, Rhiannon Corcoran, or Renan, I don't know. Is that an Irish name? For all I know, it could be Wesley. That's maybe how you pronounce that. Rhiannon Corcoran and colleagues in 2006 examined the probabilistic reasoning of those with persecutory delusions using the reasoning tasks in the heuristics and biases program. For example, one of the tasks was a version of the base rate neglect task by Tversky and Kahneman. Participants first read the following personality description and then answered whether Barry is a builder or a street robber. Betty is a skinny, rough looking individual who keeps himself to himself. He is quite a selfish person and is not very considerate towards other people. Nonetheless, Barry has a high level of awareness of what is going on around him, and his reflexes are very, very fast. Just like in the original study by Tversky and Kahneman, different base rate information is provided in different conditions. In one condition, it is said that Barry was randomly selected from 100 descriptions where 70 of them are builders and 30 of them are street robbers. The base rate information is reversed in the other condition. So instead of 70-30, it's 30-70. That's the base rate. I don't know about this story, but I know that it's coming from a set where 70% of them are, for example, builders, say. So that's the base rate. Without even reading the story, knowing that it came out of a group that's 70% builders means that there's a 70% chance that it's a builder. So that's the base rate. And then we adjust from there based on the story is what you're supposed to do with good Bayesian thinking. I gotta clean this nail. I don't know what that's from. So the result was that people without delusions largely neglected the base rate information, just like in the original study, while those with persecutory delusions were significantly more sensitive to base rate information. That's pretty wild. Nothing is coming to mind about why that would be. Oh. Wait a second. This shows that people with persecutory delusions are more rational and less biased than people with delusions. So people with schizophrenia they tend to have trouble. They don't give their observations the same weight that normal subjects do, because it's a little bit confusing in their heads what they're observing versus predicting. Is that relevant? Yeah. Yeah, so they are, I guess, updating less easily based on the information. Updating their a priori is stronger. Okay. Let us summarize our discussion so far. At this moment, it is not clear that the deductive or probabilistic reasoning of people with delusions is significantly more irrational than... Wait, what just happened? What just happened? Why did that just zoom out like that? What just happened? Wait, what if... Are there gesture controls? No. What just happened? Cause I'm trying to figure out, because what if... I don't want it to happen again. Bro, just like switch to the wide camera. That's weird. Okay. Damn it. Okay. Page. Actually, are any of the platforms even getting this thing that I'm adjusting right now? Or is everyone getting the one that I'm adjusting right now? Alright, that's probably good. Okay, so, what were we saying? Let us summarize our discussion so far. At this point, it is not clear that the deductive or probabilistic reasoning of people with delusions is significantly more irrational than the reasoning of people without delusions and without a psychiatric diagnosis. Indeed, some evidence suggests that people with delusions can perform better than people without delusions and without a psychiatric diagnosis, as far as the rationality of reasoning is concerned. So, are delusions irrational in a distinctive way? We saw that people do not need to reason irrationally to adopt delusional beliefs. But there may be some other aspect of the adoption or maintenance of delusions which suggests that something is amiss. We saw that people do not need to reason irrationally. They do not need to reason irrationally to adopt delusional beliefs. They can reason rationally and still adopt delusional beliefs. But there may be some other aspects of the adoption or maintenance of delusions which suggests that something is amiss. I'm not sure what's suggesting that something is amiss. Oh, I need to change the chat. That seems to be the chat from the other stream. Okay, so let us start with procedural irrationality. Procedural rationality. Procedural rationality concerns the relationship between a person's beliefs and their other internal states. So maybe like how coherent, how consistent that belief is with their other internal states. Give me one more. Let me adjust one more thing, actually. Let me adjust the font of this. Okay, procedurally rational beliefs are well integrated in a largely coherent system and mutually support each other. Okay, so we've got finally, well, not finally, I think we've already come across it, our essence myth. Okay. A lot of this book has frustrated me by relying on folk psychology concepts, and that's kind of crazy. I mean, it's not the only time that there are lots of philosophers and psychologists that just assume our intuitive concepts to be true and are just like trying to investigate those. They take them for granted. And this seems to be such an example. But we'll see. Maybe he's gonna say, but actually normal humans often don't have procedurally rational beliefs. Essence integration. Okay, so well integrated, largely coherent system, mutually support each other. Are delusions procedurally irrational? Some seem to be. A person with a Cotard delusion who states that she is dead might agree that typically dead people do not talk or move and recognize that she does talk and move, but remain convinced that she is dead. The beliefs the person has: 1, dead people do not talk; 2, I talk; 3, I am dead, don't hang well together. We could say that they conflict with one another and contribute to an incoherent set of beliefs. Oh, don't hang well together. That's not don't. That's they hang well together. My bad. We might be tempted to think that procedural irrationality is a distinctive feature of delusions and sets them apart from other beliefs. It is not uncommon for people to have implausible beliefs, but it is rare to hear some people endorse in the same conversation claims that clash with one another. Is it rare, bro? Is it rare, bro? Maybe for you to notice them. Or maybe I'm just thinking of moments when people are on edge, when they're getting defensive, and it's like System 1 stuff. So maybe it's rare, and especially in his setting, in this author's setting, in academia, when there's a lot of System 2 running. I mean, it's really a question of whether it's type 1 or type 2 processes running, because type 1 processes are happy to contradict each other. Okay, so, however, so I'll read that again. It is not uncommon for people to have implausible beliefs, but it is rare, according to the author, to hear people endorse in the same conversation claims that clash with one another. However, there are pervasive and significant failures of procedural rationality in non-delusional beliefs as well. This means that procedural rationality is not a distinctive feature of delusions. For instance, people who work in the police force or in hospital emergency services tend to believe that more accidents happen during nights of a full moon, even though their experience and background knowledge should speak against a full moon being a causal factor of accidents. All right, now let's move on to epistemic rationality. Epistemic rationality concerns the relationship between a person's belief and the evidence available to that person. Okay. Before and after adopting the belief. Of course, after you adopt a belief, you stop caring about the evidence. As we have seen, delusions are often defined in terms of their violation of norms of epistemic rationality. They are defined as beliefs that are ill-grounded and resistant to counter-evidence. However, there is an interesting debate in philosophy about whether delusions actually are epistemically irrational and to what extent. Because maybe they think they have the evidence. And if we were in-livering what they are, if we were, inputting the information, the experiences that they were, then we would draw the same conclusion. However, there is an interesting debate in philosophy about whether delusions actually are epistemically irrational and to what extent. As we have seen, some authors argue that a person adopting delusions is just endorsing an explanation of their anomalous experience, where such experience is evidence for the delusional belief. Similarly, it is undeniable that delusions are resistant to counter-evidence, but it is widely acknowledged that people with delusions are sensitive to evidence. They often have some insight into the implausibility of their delusions and defend their delusions from external challenges with arguments that involve presenting evidence for the delusion. Again, we might be tempted to think that epistemic irrationality is a distinctive feature of delusions and sets them apart from other beliefs. It is not uncommon for people to have beliefs that are not well supported by evidence and to hold on to their beliefs strenuously, but it is rare for people to hold on to beliefs that they themselves recognize as implausible to the same extent that people with delusions hold on to their delusions. So these people with delusions be like, I know it sounds crazy, I know you think I'm crazy, but it's true. And he's saying that healthy people don't really do that. Or maybe that's not a good quote. That these people with delusions are saying, yeah, it's extremely unlikely. In some ways it doesn't make sense, but it's true. Whereas normal people are saying don't do that. I don't know, man. I don't know if So we have resistance to counter-evidence. But then people with delusions are sensitive to counter-evidence. Now, what about normal, healthy brains with beliefs? Come on, get out of here. They're resistant to counter-evidence. I mean, I guess it might be like obviously some people in the population are less so. What about normal people? So, Okay, so I'm going to just do this again, and then we're going to try to get all the way through. Again, we might be tempted to think that epistemic irrationality is a distinctive feature of delusions and sets them apart from other beliefs. It is not uncommon for people to have beliefs that are not well supported by evidence and to hold on to beliefs strenuously, but it is rare for people to hold on to beliefs that they themselves recognize as implausible to the same extent that people with delusions hold on to their delusions. However, psychological evidence about biases in the formation and revision of beliefs, e.g., how prejudice and superstitious beliefs are adopted on flimsy evidence and how difficult it is for people to relinquish those beliefs despite an abundance of counter evidence, suggests that there are widespread and systematic failures of epistemic rationality in non-delusional beliefs as well. Great. Glad to hear him say that. Finally, let us consider agential rationality. Okay, so we have had procedural, which is the relationship between a person's belief and their other intentional states. Well, anyway, just the relationship between the person's belief and their other states, their other thoughts, and so on. Epistemic, the relationship between the person's beliefs and the evidence available to them. And then finally, agential rationality, which is the relationship between their beliefs and their behavior. Okay? This notion bridges the traditional divide between theoretical and practical rationality. We expect rational beliefs to be reflected in an agent's behavior and to guide action in the relevant circumstances. We know that people reporting delusions do not consistently act on their delusions in the appropriate circumstances. In a classic example by Eugen Bleuler, his whole name looks like a typo, a woman claimed to be the queen but did not behave like royalty. I would love for them to unpack that. Because if she was just messy, that's one thing. But you're saying that, but I think you want to tell me that, she didn't think that she needed security, or she didn't try to hide from the public eye, or she didn't behave like royalty, like hello, oh yes, okay, I see. Or even in a messy way, hello, yes, haha, yes, yep, I'm your queen, haha. Okay. Agential irrationality seems to set delusions apart from other beliefs. People may not always act on their beliefs, but it is rare for people to report beliefs with the same conviction with which people with delusions report their delusions and then show no commitment. I don't know, bro. Look at people in church on Sunday and then watch them on a Friday night. See what you think then, bro. However, the evidence on attitude, behavior, and consistencies undermines the suggestion that agential rationality is indeed a distinctive feature of delusions. Okay, great. Undermines the suggestion that agential rationality is indeed a distinctive feature of... Hold on, I just gotta check on something. There's just a charge to my card for YouTube Premium. I don't have YouTube Premium, bro. I don't know what that's about. Alright, continuing. Continuing. So, for instance, in Elliot Aronson's influential work on cognitive dissonance, we find that people are hypocritical by endorsing general principles and then denying that such principles apply to their own conduct. Exactly. Okay, so and we'll put the great. One example is college students' attitudes to safe sex in the United States. College students are likely to endorse the principle that one should always practice safe sex, but recognize that they often do not practice safe sex. The fact that they acknowledge their own conduct is violating that principle does not lead them to revisit their endorsement of the general principle. And of course, this is just yet another case of an issue that stops being confusing when you talk about what this author refers to as subagents. I don't know if he came up with that or not, but what I would refer to as its. Okay. In summary, delusions are continuous with non-delusional beliefs. Okay? They are not irrational in a distinctive way. This means that that the fact that they're pathological, this means that they're being pathological, they're being considered symptoms of mental disorders, cannot be accounted for by their irrationality alone. What then distinguishes delusions from other irrational beliefs? For example, what distinguishes the delusion that one is being harassed and harmed by envious coworkers from the irrational belief that Linda is more likely to be a feminist bank teller than just a bank teller, which is the conjunction fallacy. Obviously, it's more likely that she's going to be a bank teller than any specific kind of bank teller. Is the former more harmful than the latter? Or is the former caused by a distinctive brain dysfunction? Or should we just reject the assumption that there is a principal distinction between delusions and other irrational beliefs? What are we gonna do, gang? Alright, well, section 7.4, confabulation. Let's look at confabulation again. What is confabulation? When the term confabulation is used in a clinical context, it refers to a symptom of disorders involving severe memory impairments, such as dementia and amnesia. In this section, we will focus on clinical confabulation, also called narrow confabulation, where an inaccurate or ill-grounded claim is made as a result of a memory impairment. Okay, so split brain cases apparently not going to be considered in this clinical confabulation, which is weird. But anyway, as in the case of delusion, there are controversies about the best definition of confabulation. See box D for two popular definitions characterizing confabulation as either a fabricated or distorted memory or a false belief. I mean, I would define it as a story told with little, what's a good word for this? A non-diligent story told to reconcile apparently conflicting bits of information. So that's what I would say. A non-diligent, or like, I don't want to say a careless, but yeah, a non-diligent story constructed to reconcile conflicting. We're just going to make information accountable noun, informations. All right, there you go. Okay. So now I want to look at box 7D and 7E. So here are some definitions of confabulation. Fatopoulou said, an extreme form of pathological memory distortion is confabulation, i.e., the production of fabricated or distorted memories about oneself or the world without the conscious intention to deceive. Turnbull and Jenkins said, confabulations are typically understood to represent instances of false beliefs, opinions about the world that are manifestly incorrect and yet are held by the patient to be true in spite of clearly presented evidence to the contrary. All right, now let's look at some features of confabulation. So lack of awareness that the memory report is false or distorted, no intention to deceive or lie. The story is usually drawn from the person's memory, and the story can be either coherent and plausible or incoherent and unrealistic. Okay. So what most definitions have in common is that they describe confabulation in terms of an epistemic fault and make no specific reference to underlying mechanisms. Here is an example of confabulation. HW, who has memory impairments due to frontal damage, correctly reports that he is married and that he has 4 children. Okay, so far so good, HW. When he is asked how long he... One moment, please. Okay, when he is asked how long he has been married, he correctly replies 4 months instead of 30 years. When he is asked how it is that he has 4 children after only 4 months of marriage, impossible. He claims that his children were adopted, even though they are in fact his natural children. And not only are HW's reports about his autobiographical past incorrect, he is also resistant to challenges from his interlocutors. Okay, so I see. So my definition is... This is for... So I understand. There are 2 types of confabulation, I guess. Because Gazzaniga definitely uses the word confabulation when he's talking about split brain patients. And he's not talking about memory there. So maybe it's... Well, anyway. So this definition, of course, does not work when we're just talking about like a false memory conviction. That's not the same thing as the left brain interpreter coming up with something in Gazzaniga's work. Different types of confabulation have been identified, and differences occur in either form or content. The form of confabulations can be spontaneous or provoked. Spontaneous confabulations, usually associated with a frontal dysfunction, are unsolicited reports, whereas provoked confabulations are answers to direct questioning that may occur in the absence of an identified impairment. Okay, so there's unsolicited reports versus direct questioning. The content of confabulations can be fantastic or mundane. Spontaneous confabulations tend to be fantastic, and provoked confabulations tend to be mundane. It's interesting. I guess that intuitively that makes sense, but I don't really know why. A further distinction can be made between primary and secondary confabulations. Okay. Primary confabulation is an initial inaccurate report about the past. Secondary confabulation is a further report that is offered to support the primary confabulation. There are competing accounts of the way confabulations arise. On some accounts of confabulation, motivational factors are key, and on other accounts, cognitive neuropsychological factors prevail. What? What? What does that mean? Do you think that motivation is an extraneural thing? The former may involve embellishing a memory report to feel better about oneself, for instance, to feel that one is more skilled or more independent than one actually is, which would be the self-serving bias. The latter may involve a deficit in retrieval strategies, e.g. an inability to access relevant memories, a confusion of the temporal order of remembered events, e.g. an inability to determine chronology, a deficit in the construction of memories, e.g. exaggerated memory reconstruction, or poor source monitoring, e.g. something imagined is reported as something remembered. Several researchers have argued that to understand how confabulations arise, we need to combine neuropsychological and motivational factors. Yeah, no kidding. So one suggestion, so to understand how confabulations arise, we have here one suggestion is to apply the 2-factor theory we saw in our discussion of delusions to the case of confabulation. The 2-factor theory was that there's the abnormal experience and then also So there's the experience, which may or may not be abnormal. And then there's the reasoning about the experience, which may or may not be abnormal. Okay, so the experience itself and then the reasoning about the experience. So the first factor would be responsible for the presence of the confabulation in the first place, right? And then the second would explain why the confabulation is accepted as true. So there's an initial false belief, because that's what was experienced. But then if that's maintained, it seems like there would be an issue with reasoning. In the case of confabulation, similar to the case of delusion, the second factor would be a failure to inhibit explanatory hypotheses or memories that are implausible or ill-grounded and would occur in all instances of confabulation. The first factor would be the neuropsychological factor, potentially different in different pathologies. Why? Why are they not both neuropsychological? So the first factor would be responsible for the presence of the confabulation, and the second would explain why the confabulation is actually subscribed to, maintained, what have you. Hello, mother. How we doing? Indeed, it is unlikely that a single deficit underpins all pathological cases of confabulation, since confabulation is associated with pathologies that have different neurobiological bases, including amnesic syndromes, damage to the anterior cerebral artery, traumatic brain injury, neglect, delusions of misidentification, dimensions, and anosognosia, which is like the denial of an illness. So confabulation can also occur in the absence of any known pathology. We saw in Chapter 2 that instances of confabulation where no deficit is observed are common. The stocking experiment is an example where people offer explanations for their consumer choices that are not well grounded. So, does confabulation... Hey, mama, give me a like, mama. Unless you've already done that, in which case, great job. Thanks so much for the endorsement. This is my mother's, by the way. I did not graduate from, well, anywhere. Okay, so does confabulation distort reality in a distinctive way? Now that we better understand the phenomenon of clinical or narrow confabulation, we can turn to the question of whether memory distortions that are displayed in confabulatory reports are distinctive. Alright, so that's our question now. Thank you, Mother. In confabulation, the content of memory reports does not match reality. The resulting beliefs may be false and ill-grounded, as the person lacks autobiographical evidence on which to base their claims due to the memory impairment. Past events are reported differently from how they were experienced. In some cases, the distortion reflects a bias. The person may deny an unpleasant event, such as a family fallout, or exaggerate past personal achievements. So this is kind of the motivational thing that we are talking about. To exaggerate past personal achievements, for example. Also in confabulation, the content of memory reports may be inconsistent with other things people believe or remember, which causes tension. Dissonance. This means that for people who confabulate due to a clinical impairment, memory reports may at the same time fail to match reality and, lack internal coherence. We may think that a lack of correspondence with the facts and inconsistencies are distinctive features of memory reports and are the result of serious memory impairments. However, recent psychological research suggests that there are widespread everyday memory distortions. Oh, mind blown. What? Daniel Schachter's work has been very influential in this area. recent. This book was written in 2021, but whatever. Was it, or is it even more? Isn't that book even more recent? Why are they calling it recent? What is their scale? 2021. So Daniel Schachter talks about 7 common sins of memory. Oh, that is so good for my Warsaw illusions. That is so exciting. So that's box 7F. That's awesome. That's awesome. So Warsaw storage illusions. Oh, that's awesome. Absolutely gonna be adopted. So that's page 218. Warsaw storage 7 sins. Excellent. So, so he talks about 7 common sins of memory. Sins of memory. Sins of omission occur when people forget something that they should be able to remember, whatever should means. Sins of commission occur when people believe that they remember more than what they actually experience or report an event differently. Or report an event differently from how they experienced it. When we look more closely at Schachter's 7 sins of memory, we realize that the distortions described are not different in kind from those we observe in clinical confabulations. The most common sources of memory distortion are misattribution and bias. Here are some memory distortions that have been studied in some detail. In imagination inflation, people who imagine an event that never occurred subsequently falsely recall that the event did occur. Okie dokie, imagination inflation. In the Dies-Rodiger-McDermott effect, that's fine, people presented with a list of words falsely believe that some items that are semantically related to the words on the list were also on the list. This experimental paradigm was developed by Dies in 1959 and was revised by Rodiger and McDermott. In the post-information effect, people seemingly remember details of an experienced event, e.g. a summer ball in their college, but not some detail of that event, e.g. their friend dancing the waltz. This detail was learnt from another source at a later stage, e.g. from the friend who talked about it the next day, and then incorporated into the memory report. 10 years later, they go, yeah, I remember you were doing that, but actually, no, you didn't experience me doing that. It was just that I told you the next day. There's also the misinformation effect, which is that we don't really remember the source of the information. So we can hear a joke or something that was debunked and then recall it later as true and, coming seriously from a credible source. The misrepresentation often fits with what the person wishes to believe or with what they predict would have, or what they would have predicted. The misrepresentation often fits with what the person wishes to believe. After taking a study skills class, people asked about their performance, exaggerated how bad it was before the class, and exaggerated how good it was after the class, to lend support to the view that the class had helped them improve their skills. Indeed, people's present beliefs, feelings, and opinions affect the way they remember past events. For instance, the so-called consistency bias occurs when people interpret the past in the light of the present. So people were asked to rate their attitudes toward major social issues, such as whether drugs should be legalized, whether women should be treated equally, and whether ethnic minorities should be helped. 9 years later, the same participants were asked to rate their attitudes again and to report what their attitudes had been the first time around. Participants remembered their past attitudes as much closer than they to their current attitudes than they actually were. Right? And you could do the same thing with marriage equality. That would be really well, you would have had to have already done it, in like 2003 and then do it again in like 2023. In the context of dementia and other neuropsychological disorders, memory beliefs are vulnerable to both misattribution and bias. One instance of misattribution is when salient life events are not reported in the right chronological order or are ignored altogether. In this case, it is harder to identify systematic connections among life events. In our earlier example of Jacob reporting that he had been on a walk with his mother that very morning, when in fact the event had taken place several years earlier, Jacob's memory is not entirely fabricated, it is just given the wrong time tag. This might make it harder for Jacob to identify links between individual events and things he knows. He might see himself as a young man when he is actually in his 70s. And he might expect his mother to be still alive, even though she has long passed away. As in everyday instances of biases, recollections of the past are distorted in patients with brain damage in such a way as to present their past selves in a better light. Stories that depart from reality are not accepted by the person's close social circles and may create tension there, but self-enhancing memories can have positive effects on mood regulation. By putting a positive spin on their experiences, people feel better about themselves, and this brings with it some clinical and pragmatic advantages too. Optimistically biased memories are generally correlated with reduced stress and good physical and psychological health, but there are also possible costs, such as when people underestimate risk. On some occasions, people do not change the past to fit the present, but rather change the present to fit the past. This is known as a failure in updating. People describe their present selves as much more similar to their past selves than they actually are. For instance, people developing a chronic or degenerative disease may continue to view themselves as they were before the onset of the disease and may not acknowledge some of their physical or psychological changes. People with dementia experience a shift in personality as a result of their condition, becoming more aloof, introverted, unassured, and submissive. However, they do not necessarily have awareness of such changes and tend to underestimate how unassured and submissive they have become. This lack of awareness ensures that their concept of self remains largely coherent. Both the principles of internal coherence and correspondence with the facts apply to autobiographical memory. Memories are sometimes altered to preserve a coherent self as the past is rewritten to make sense of the current self-concept, or the present is redescribed in a way that makes it more continuous with the past. I see. So this is called updating failure. Okay, so there's consistency bias and then updating failure. In summary, in this section, we have suggested that distortions of memory and clinical confabulation are not different in kind from distortions of memory in everyday life, and that in both contexts, distortions present themselves as instances of common sins of memory. As the debates on delusions have inspired a renewed interest in the nature of belief, the pervasiveness and the adaptiveness of memory distortions have informed the lively debate about the function of human memory. Is memory supposed to contribute to knowledge of the past or to ensure that agents maintain a coherent sense of self? So, conclusion, not different in kind. Okay, so how do we remember? If memory distortion does not occur exclusively in disordered minds, but is a much more common phenomenon than we might have initially suspected, how can we explain the widespread fallibility of human memory capacity? How does the frequency of memory errors change the way we think about human memory? One influential view is that the memory distortions we discussed, both the everyday ones and the ones we encounter in clinical confabulation, are due to the reconstructive nature of autobiographical memory. Okay. According to some psychologists, memory distortion suggests that there is more than one memory system in humans, and that such systems operate differently. Whereas semantic memory, memory of a fact that has not been experienced, such as remembering that Rome is the capital of Italy or that World War II ended in 1945, is mostly reproductive. Okay, so semantic memory is reproductive. Okay, episodic memory, memory of a fact that is first personally experienced, is mostly reconstructive. Okay. When memory is reproductive, stored information is retrieved at a later time and becomes the content of a belief about the past. Reproductive memory is often used using the analogy of a library or a storehouse. Get out. Yeah, a library where every time someone checks out the book, they make little edits because of consistency bias, updating failure. Yeah, if you have if what do you call library goers? If library goers have a tendency to vandalize or edit. All right. Reproductive memory is often when memory is reconstructive, stored information is used to construct a belief about the past. Reconstructive memory is often described as the work of a detective who works through limited clues to arrive at a solution to a mystery. In a reproductive memory system, there can be gaps and errors when stored information is not properly encoded or cannot be retrieved. But in a reconstructive memory system, there can also be distortions when the memory of the event that is inferred from the stored information makes sense, but does not correspond to how the event was experienced in the past. The reconstructive nature of autobiographical memory and episodic memory would explain the memory distortions we reviewed in both clinical and non-clinical contexts. So what are the implications of episodic memory being reconstructive? A reconstructive memory system can be seen as a disadvantage. If inference is necessary, in order, what happened? I gotta infer and put together a story. Well, then distortions can occur. But it can also be seen as an advantage, because it may be more energy efficient, right? Let's see if that's what he says. For instance, in a move that reminds us of Giger Renzer's attempt to describe heuristics as a manifestation of ecological rationality, Schachter argues that memory distortions are not simply epistemic failures. Memory distortions reveal the adaptiveness of memory mechanisms. Schachter's claim is not that it is adaptive to have distorted memories, but that it is adaptive to have a memory system that results in the occasional distorted memory. Why? Let's see. Tell us, Schachter. While it is tempting to conclude that memory distortions point to fundamental flaws in the nature or composition of memory, a growing number of researchers have argued that, to the contrary, many memory distortions reflect the operation of adaptive processes. That is, processes that contribute to the efficient functioning of memory, but as a consequence of serving that role, also produce distortions. Still don't know exactly what the advantage is. I see the word efficient. Let us see how this would work for some of the memory distortions we considered. Energy saver? Maybe that's what we're referring to. I'm not gonna be able to read that. Saver. Question mark. Ugh, whatever. Let us see how this would work for some of the memory distortions we considered in the previous section. For instance, the DRM effect, when people remember certain items as being on a list of words because the items are semantically related to words that were actually on the list. That's an obvious distortion leading to an inaccurate memory report, e.g., that the word bread was on a list where there actually was flour, dough, yeast, bop bop. However, it also reveals, so it's an obvious distortion. However, it also reveals associative processes that benefit the organization and retention of information and facilitate inference. Okay, so that's something that's adaptive. It is good for people to be able to associate semantically related items, as it saves cognitive effort. There we go. As it saves cognitive effort in a number of circumstances. If one goes shopping for the ingredients of a recipe for baking bread, associations between semantically related items, flour and yeast, make it easier for one to remember what to buy. Similarly, imagination inflation can be viewed in a positive light. So imagination inflation, you imagine something, but then you remember it as actually having happened. Consider Isla coming to believe that she broke her arm when she was 5, when this is just something she only imagined. Isla has false beliefs about her past. I broke my arm, and is also likely to form further beliefs that are consistent with the false memory report and equally fail to reflect reality, such as I had to wear a cast or I missed a day at school. But the fact that people integrate some imagined events into their autobiographical memories also suggests that the same mechanisms are sometimes involved in both remembering the past and imagining the future. And this allows for flexibility of thought, for instance, when making plans for the future based on past experience. The capacity to combine traces of information in different ways enables agents to make predictions about novel future events, facilitating flexible predictions about the future that draw on a diversity of information about the past. According to Puttyfoot and Bortolotti, the latter being a co-author here. Okay, cool. Alright, and that's it for chapter 7. So, is the cat still outside? I will be right back. Hey, you wanna come in? Hey, what's that? Oh my gosh, that tuna's been out. Wow. Totally forgot there was tuna out. That's crazy, and they're still not eating it. Good boys. Don't do it. Oh, I gotta move the camera over there. Oh no, wrong way. Okay, section 7.5, a summary. So delusions are defined as irrational beliefs. They can have various themes and can be more or less widespread in a belief system. On most accounts, delusions are formed in response to anomalous experience, but it is controversial whether reasoning deficits or biases also contribute to the formation of delusions. When it comes to standards of good reasoning, it is not clear that people with delusions reason irrationally. Evidence suggests that people with delusions reason differently from people without a psychiatric diagnosis, but it does not show that the former reason more irrationally than the latter. Delusions are certainly irrational in several ways, but the irrationality of delusions is not different in kind from the irrationality of non-delusional beliefs. The pathological nature of delusions therefore cannot be accounted for by their irrationality alone. In a number of mental disorders and in several everyday contexts, human memory fails and memory reports are distorted. Distortions can have different forms and different causes, from memory impairments to biases. There is considerable continuity between distortions in clinical and non-clinical contexts, and many everyday memory reports turn out to be distorted. This suggests that some human memory systems operate reconstructively, where the report is the result of an attempt to fill gaps in information with plausible inferences. Boom! Great job! Let's do the questions, and then we are done with chapter 7. We're going to stop the stream and then do the final chapter, autism and psychopathy. So keep an eye on my channel, or do the notifications or whatever, so that you can join us in just a couple minutes. So questions. 1, how do you define delusions? What are necessary conditions for a belief to be delusional? What are sufficient conditions for a belief to be delusional? 2, list some examples of everyday irrational beliefs that you or someone you know have or used to have, and compare them with delusions. How are they similar? How are they different? That would be incredible if you can think of an everyday irrational belief that you currently have, but probably easier to partner up with someone. But then you might just get into an argument. We'll see. Question 3, a delusion is considered as a pathological mental state, while the false belief that Linda is more likely to be a feminist bank teller than a bank teller is not. Why? Well, because that's just more of an answer that you come up with. It's not like a thing that you commit to. Maybe some part of you does, as Gold described. Number 4, Richard Dawkins calls the religious belief in God the God delusion, and endorses Robert Pirsig's statement, "When one person suffers from a delusion, it is called insanity. When many people suffer from a delusion, it is called religion." Do you agree with Dawkins? How are religious beliefs and delusions similar? How are they different? Yeah, I guess you know what? I never thought of that. That one difference is the community aspect. That's cool. It's interesting. And that's it. All right, so I will see you in just a minute.